starting.
Okay, good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I am Mark Leon. I'm the Director of Rotman Design Works here at the Rotman School. And thank you all for coming this evening to see our special speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce David Burkus this evening. David will give a presentation on his new book, The Myths of Creativity, the truth about how innovative companies and people generate great ideas. And what I really love about it is that he goes against some of the commonly held myths around creativity and innovation, that it's not actually you're born with it or it's a God-given right. It's something that you can actually learn and practice and teach, which is good for us here as educators. Before we bring David up to the front, I'll give you a brief introduction. David is the founder and editor of Leader Lab, a podcast that shares insights from research on leadership, innovation, and strategy. He's also the assistant professor of management at Oral Roberts University and a regular columnist for 99U and the Creativity Post. So please give us a warm Rotman welcome to David Burkus.
Well, first of all, thank you all so much for having me, for coming out to hear little old me. But also thank you for having me. I have been a really big admirer of the work that Rotman's doing, so to be able to sort of be a part of it in a really small way is really, really cool and exciting for me. I really feel like this is one of the few schools of business in general that's putting some actual thought into being a thought leader. And I think that's really, really cool. So that's very exciting for me to be a part of it. So thank you all for you all for coming and for having me, et cetera. I guess the best place to start is with an explanation of where this whole idea comes from. And it started with a really simple premise. And that is that the stories that we tell ourselves are true even if they're not true. In other words, the things that you're telling yourself or about the way the world works will affect the way that you view the world and hence will prove itself to be true. The fancy psychological term is confirmation bias, but I'm a storyteller, so I like it this way. The stories we tell ourselves are true, even if they're not true. And one of the things that became apparent to me when I was finishing up a doctoral program was just how many stories there were around creativity and innovation and how many of them were rubbish, right? We have this interesting notion when you talk to the average person, and I know because I surveyed the average person, and when you talk to a senior leader of a corporation, and I know because I surveyed them too, we have these stories that come up, these conceptions about creativity that don't really line up with, I think, something that can be all that useful. In other words, when people talk about creativity, they talk about it in a way that really doesn't escape our old mentalities towards it. They approach it almost as if it were a religion. That if you're creative, you're a high priest of a certain religion. And I know several people who exclaim to me that they are a creative. And some of them look very much like a priest in some esoteric religion. So it can be that way. But what I mean by that is if you look through the history of our approach towards creativity, it's been inextricably linked to this sort of mysterious and approached as if it were the divine. Right, so the ancient Greeks believed in muses. They believed in these near divine sisters that would visit mere mortals, give them all of their insights. Right? You had different muses for different industries, as we would call them, different sectors. Right? So you had a muse for engineering and one for poetry. And you would go and worship at the shrine of that particular muse, hoping to get your idea. Some people probably hedged their bets and went to all of them, which made for a really busy worship week. But regardless, you still sort of see this, right? We talk about the word in English, museum, which literally translates into the cult place of the muse. The idea behind a museum was let's put together the creative works that the muses gave us so we can celebrate what they gave to us, and hence hopefully get more of it, right? I see it actually, so I'm an American and I see it in American history. I see Benjamin Franklin, when he was in France, participated in a group that met in a hall that translated the 9 Sisters. Right? They literally had it that way. And we even use phrases in English like inspired, which literally means breathed upon. All of these are getting at this idea that there is something divine and mysterious about creativity. And the reason I choose the term myths is because myths are stories that we tell ourselves to try and explain something we can't explain. Something we don't have enough evidence for, something we just have a hazy glimpse at. And in telling ourselves that stories, the myth sort of becomes our way of explaining reality. In some cases, we tell ourselves myths to reinforce social norms. Right? In other cases, we're just trying to make sense of the world around us. But with a lot of different myths throughout history, as we learn more about the world, the myths become less relevant. And I believe we're at that point with creativity. I believe we have the residue of lots of different myths of creativity that it's time to sort of abandon and replace with what the truth is. Right? And it begins with, I think, one of the most prevalent ideas in general, which is where does creativity come from? This is what the Greeks were trying to solve. And I find my answer in the research of a woman named Teresa Immobile. She's a brilliant woman. She teaches at the Harvard Business School now. If you ever get the chance to talk to her, she is an absolute sweetheart, too. She's a wonderful woman. But what she calls the componential model of creativity basically has 4 elements. This is all creative insights happen when 4 things are at play at the same time. Now, the expertise is the beginning. Expertise essentially says you have to know a little bit about your domain in order to make a contribution to it. Interestingly enough, there's some debate over how much expertise you actually need and when expertise could actually sort of limit your ability to see things. More on that later. But in general, we need to know, right? An engineer needs to know a little bit about physics in order to work, right? And even in traditional sort of creative industries, we need to understand how the programs we're going to be using to design work. We need to understand how the principles and rules of aesthetic design, et cetera. So you need some level of expertise. But you also need creative thinking skills or a creative thinking process. And this is something different from your domain expertise. I think a lot of times we blur the two. But this is something different from it. This is a process that you know and trust. This is a set of tools that you can use in that creative process. This is what we mean when we say creative thinking. And then the last thing that Immobile said needed to be involved in the person is motivation. You have to actually want to solve the problems you're looking to have a creative insight for. In general, the research suggests that intrinsic motivation works better than extrinsic. Extrinsic can work under a set of circumstances we're still sort of discovering as far as just how narrow they go. And in general, I think this motivation piece actually speaks to the phrase, necessity is the mother of invention, right? Or necessity is the mother of innovation, whichever flavor you like of that. Because necessity creates motivation. Right? If I need something, I'm pretty motivated to figure out what I need. Right? So this is the motivation piece. But you remember I said there are 4. And the broadest of the 4 is the social environment. This is the blue on the red that the individual has. Because the social environment is really important, and it's the only of these that you don't necessarily have an effect over. You can choose what social environment you operate in, but you're not the only one shaping that social environment. And to me, as a professor of management, this is really exciting because this is the role of organizational leaders. Not just in making sure people have expertise and creative thinking skills and are properly motivated, but we shape the social environment. And we decide, are they tolerant of new ideas, or do we reject new ideas? Do we allow information sharing, or do we keep people siloed in our traditional rigid hierarchies? How are we going to structure our social environment to either kill or nourish creativity? And when all of those things are in play, we can have our creative ideas. But how we have them is still a little bit mythical, right? So there's this idea, the first of the myths that I try and attack in the book is this idea of the Eureka Myth, right? And simply put, you all are familiar with the Eureka Myth because Isaac Newton sat under an apple tree. And what happened? An apple fell on him. And then what happened? He had an idea and he discovered, several people said discovered and then pulled back. Discovered gravity, right? Which is the simplified version of the story. But if you've ever seen the Roman aqueducts or the pyramids, we had a good idea of how the whole gravity thing worked, right? He didn't discover it. He did figure out how to explain it, right? But I don't really know where the whole apple thing came from, right? Actually, I do. I tried my best to get to the root of this story, to figure out, right? This is sort of like, in the States, we have a story about George Washington and the cherry tree, or our founder couldn't tell a lie, chopped down. Never happened. And I wondered if the same thing was going on here with Newton and the apple. Something about apple trees can signal that the story is rubbish, right? So what I found, the closest, the earliest written record of this apple tree story was written down by a gentleman by the name of William Stuckley, and he was an apprentice of Isaac Newton's. And Stuckley writes down in his journal about one particular night when he and Newton are having dinner. They go out to the garden for tea. And as they're having tea, Newton points at an apple and he says, I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking that the same force that compels an apple to the ground might be what can help explain the motion of all of our planetary bodies. Right? Maybe it's the invisible force we're looking for. That's it. That's the end of the story. Apple's on the ground. Newton and Stuckley are over here. Right? Then, throughout history, as we retell it, and you look at some more modern tellings, right? Newton gets closer to the apple, right? And Stuckley disappears. Poor guy. He wrote the story down, but he just disappears, right? And the apple raises up and attaches itself to the tree, and gradually we have... Truthfully, the first time it was written down as if Newton got hit by the apple, it was written down as satire. As wouldn't it be funny if Newton got hit by the apple and that's what triggered it? But that's the story we like, right? So we keep telling it. even though it doesn't really serve us. And here's what I mean. Who is the protagonist in the story of Newton and the apple? The apple. If it weren't for the apple, nothing would have happened, right? In the story we tell ourselves. Which not only, right, sort of puts way too much pressure on apples and fruit, right? Which I don't think we should trust fruit for our creative insights. But puts a little too much pressure on fruit. It also sort of ignores all of the hard work Newton was doing before and after that insight. Even if the story were true, there was still a lot of work that had to happen on one side of the apple, and a lot of work on the other side to prove that the apple idea was true. Right? If the apple had hit Newton and he had an idea for some total other explanation, we would have never heard this story, right? Because he would have tested it, found it not true, and then we would have just forgotten the story, right? No one wants to hear a story about a guy getting hit with fruit that doesn't generate any cool ideas. We don't tell that story, right? But it could have happened. So the real challenge, though, is that this story helps us explain something that's going on inside ourselves so often. How many people have ever had an idea and it feels like it came from nowhere? Feels like you got hit in the head with a piece of fruit. It happens, right? The reason that it happens is because of a phenomenon known as incubation. Our brains work in a really, really interesting process, and in that process they can actually benefit from taking some time off. Time off from the problem we're working on. We have trouble explaining. There's a bunch of different attempts at explanations of what happens in that time off, but we do know two things. The first is that time off doesn't need to be sitting under an apple tree or taking a bath if we're Archimedes. It doesn't need to be long walks or showers, right? It could also just be switching to something else, right? Something more rote, something more boring, something that lets your subconscious sort of wander, right? Even if your conscious is engaged. Which is good, because I work in a job where I can't just sit down on the ground and lay there and wait for an idea. If they walk by my office, they'll wonder what I'm doing with my office hours. Right? And I suspect many of you do too. Right? It's not an acceptable answer to go, boss, I need an idea. I'm going to go sit under an apple tree. Right? Doesn't work. So this idea of incubation can be used either in total relaxation or can be used just task switching and going to something. The other thing, and I think this is, to me, the most compelling explanation of what's going on in incubation, is that our mind is sort of forgetting all of the old wrong answers. Because we think in a form of connections, the way our minds work. It's a series of connections. And sometimes the connections that we have been down are easier to go down in the past. Right? So if you've ever tried to work on a really hard problem and you end up with the same wrong answer multiple times, you've experienced this. Because your mind is going down a pathway it feels like is really familiar. And so what I think, and there are multiple explanations of incubation, but the one that I like the best is this idea that in that time you are selectively forgetting those routes. Because your mind is taking none of those routes. Which means when we return to the problem, all of the possible connections are again more open to us. We're not going to sort of slide down to that way. And sometimes in this period of incubation, we can have a moment that feels like a revelation. We can call it, I love the television show Dr. House, right? So we can have a house moment where we're bouncing a ball or doing something and it comes from nowhere because we're incubating, right? We all, if you're not familiar with the TV show House, I will tell you every episode ever. Patient comes in, they're dying. House nearly kills them, trying lots of different stuff. House takes a break to go into his office and make fun of his assistants. Gets an idea, saves the patient. That's every episode from all 8 seasons, right? And it glorifies that idea that it comes sort of from outside of ourselves, that it comes from nowhere. And the truth is it came from kind of inside of ourselves, right? And we need that time of selectively forgetting all of our old ideas that were leading us in the wrong way. And that's what House is really benefiting for. And I like this version of the Eureka Myth because I can use this one. I can build incubation time into my life when I'm working on a hard problem. Right? The way that I do it, and you might be different, is I don't know about you, but I get a lot of emails that aren't really all that urgent and don't really require a lot of focus. Right? Things like having to schedule dates for stuff, or even just reply and say thank you. Right? Even though I hate every time I get an email that just says thank you, but I still feel obliged to send it. So I can attack those emails in my incubation time. I'm working on a new article. I'm working on a book proposal. I'm working on designing sort of a new lecture. And when I get stuck, I turn to sort of my long file of emails that are not urgent or important. And I work my way through them for a little while, and then I return, which allows me to sort of stay productive but also incubate. Now, everybody is different. That's my method. You're welcome to invent your own. But the idea is if you can find a way to just switch tasks onto something that doesn't really require the same section of your brain, the same thought patterns to solve, you can take advantage of incubation and generate sort of your ideas. You can do it either by waiting for it to come, like a Dr. House moment, or you can force it. It's a variety of creative thinking techniques that you can use that are shown to work much better after a period of incubation. So whichever way you go, you can benefit from this idea of incubation. I like that. I like that about the myth. Now, I said earlier this idea of experts, right? That expertise is an important part of what goes on. We know from incubation that if you don't have the insight, we need some creative thinking skills. We also know from the model that we need some expertise. But just how much expertise is up for debate? There's a joke in the physics domain that if you don't do Nobel Prize-winning work by the time you're 30, you should retire, which is a little mean, right? But it's actually kind of true, right? So we think about notable physicists, right? And the first one that comes to mind is, go ahead, you're all thinking Albert Einstein. It's okay to say it. Right?
I was thinking Sheldon.
You're right. You're right. Good call. Okay, so most of you were thinking Albert Einstein, right? So, and we think of him white hair, sticking his tongue out, right? That thing we've all seen on a T-shirt or a poster or a mouse pad, if those still exist, right? We've all seen that photo of Albert Einstein as an older gentleman, right? And Albert Einstein was, middle-aged when he won the Nobel Prize. He was 46, right? Which is old to a 20-year-old, but not old to a 46-year-old. But Albert Einstein won the Nobel Prize for a paper that was published when he was 26, when he would have probably considered himself old, right? And there's some truth to this, because the age that people are when they publish the work that wins the Nobel Prize does sort of hover around that. We've done a lot of interesting studies on mapping out people's career productivity over the course of their lifetime. And what we find is that almost every field suffers from an inverted U. And the inverted U is not attributed to just them getting older and working less, right? So in physics, that inverted U, it rises up, and then nearly around 30, it sort of goes down. In humanities, it's a little bit later. In social sciences, it's a little bit later, right? Think back to your own college experiences, whether you had them a long time ago or now. You can still kind of see that depending on certain fields, your professors seem to be older in different domains. I think that actually tracks with these inverted U's. Maybe not. We'll see. So what explains this inverted U, though, is not just focused effort, not just time spent on projects. The explanation that we've come up with is that when you look at creative productivity, you have two things really that control it: your ideation rate and your elaboration rate. So an ideation rate is the frequency with which you're coming up with ideas. And your elaboration rate is the rate at which you're actually expounding, testing those ideas. And what seems to be happening over time is that the ideation rate doesn't slow down, but the elaboration rate does. And the best possible explanation for this is that as you're coming up with new ideas, your mind is immediately leaping to reasons it won't work based on your past experiences. Which is why it's really hard to see outside of a problem when you've spent decades in it, right? If you've spent decades learning the way that things are supposed to work, it's really hard to confront the fact that maybe they don't, right? And the truth is, most of this is in service of what they're doing, because most of those ideas that when your ideation rate stays the same and your elaboration rate goes down, most of the ideas that are being killed by that elaboration decline actually wouldn't work. Every once in a while, some of them do. And it's the people that don't have all of those experiences to say why it won't work, and who are willing to commit to actually trying it and learning from it, even if it doesn't work, that end up doing the work that wins the Nobel Prize. They're the ones who are willing to confront sort of conventional wisdom because they don't know any better. In the book, I highlight a friend of mine, who's grown to be a friend of mine now, who designs clinical prosthetics. And he had a challenge where he had a patent for design and a grant for design that every engineer he talked to said would never work. So he hired a bunch of interns, people who didn't already know, engineering students who didn't already know what wouldn't work. And he lied to them and said, this is possible. Let's figure out how. And since they didn't know any better, they tried a variety of options, and they eventually found a way to make it work. That was a much messier process, I'm sure, than what experts could have done. But it worked, right? And it worked because people were willing to experiment with that idea. Now, this is not a death sentence. This is what I like. It is possible to keep your ideation rate and your elaboration rate increasing. When that happens, you become almost a creative genius. You become someone like Paul Erdos. Has anyone ever heard of Paul Erdos? I didn't suspect so, because you're not a mathematician. Or I'm going to assume you're not a mathematician. If you are, you probably know your Erdos number. Right? Paul Erdos is most notable for publishing more peer-reviewed papers than anyone else ever. We lost count just shy of 1,600. We don't actually know how many he published. 1,600. Right? And as a result, people start calculating their Erdos number, which is a number that signifies how close you all are to Erdos's work. You have a number 1, you published with him. You have a number 2, you published with someone who published with him, etc. Sort of like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, but with Paul Erdos. And the reason Erdos was able to be so productive is that he wasn't really limited to just his little subdomain. He was an intellectual nomad. He was famous for reading a paper and showing up on the doorstep of the office or sometimes the home of the person who wrote that paper and saying, "My brain is open." "My brain is open" is actually the title they gave to his biography because it was such a known thing. If he showed up and said, "My brain is open," you were going to work with Paul Erdos. And he would contribute his slice of sub-knowledge, and you would contribute yours, and together you would collaborate. And when he had his fill, he would move on to the next thing that fascinated him, to the next person, and he would say, "My brain is open," again, and he would just keep moving. Now, in a little bit more modern lingo, I think there's a much better single term that can sort of define how to be a Paul Erdos, and that is to be T-shaped. Right? The idea behind T-shaped, it's not a new idea. It's one actually I think a lot of people here might be familiar with. But the idea behind being T-shaped is to have a deep specialization in one area, but to have a broad understanding of lots of areas. Right? And when the insights occur because you get T-shaped people together, they occur because someone is either taking an idea from part of the horizontal T and applying it to the vertical, or vice versa, taking something they know from the deep vertical and saying, well, what if it would work over here? And you can grow to be T-shaped. Now, most of our training over time actually starts out broad and then gets narrower and narrower. And as a result, by the end of a formal education system, you usually look like an I, maybe like a capital serif I, so you have a little bit, but you don't look like a T. Right? But you can grow that way. There are a variety of things you can do that can grow you that way. But first, before that, if you're willing to be a little bit brave, I'm going to prove to you that this idea works inside of 3 minutes. And here's how we're going to do it. We're going to play a little game. I need everybody to get a partner. Someone hopefully you don't know, but if you're sitting next to somebody you do know, that's okay. And what you want to do is you want to decide between you and your partner who of you is going to be what I call the expert and the hobbyist. And the hobbyist has a very important role. The expert's job is easy. You're just going to talk about a problem you're having at work if you're the expert. If you're the hobbyist, I need you to take the work hat off and put on whatever hat signifies whatever hobby you really, really like. So if you love fishing, you're a fisherman today. If you love watching sports, you're an armchair quarterback today, right? Whatever your hobby is. If you love shopping, you're a shopper. If you love gardening, you're a gardener, right? And I want you to hear what the expert is saying about their problem through the ears of your hobby. And then point out what connections you might make and how it could be helpful. But you only have a very short period of time. So decide quickly and get going. And if you are the hobbyist, don't worry. We'll work on you. How did that work? How did that feel, first of all? Interesting. Good. Anybody get a really interesting insight out of it? And vulnerable enough to share? Confident enough to share? All right.
I think possibly I got an analogy of, I got a golfer's perspective. So it was, and I thought it was kind of interesting using the analogy of a golf bag, because in your golf bag you have different clubs. So using that idea of not just going with maybe a single sort of focus, but using multiple approaches in order to achieve the goal.
Yeah, no, a solid analogy. So, but if you didn't hear, what he was saying was he got to hear back his situation through a golfer's perspective, and having a golf bag that has lots of different tools on it. It's pretty hard to make your way through 18 holes with just one club, or even just one club and just one ball. If you're me, you need actually far more balls than you have clubs. Most of the time when my friends and I go golfing, we put a set number, like 5 golf balls, and whoever keeps the 5 the longest wins. Score regardless. So it works really well, and this is something that you can use almost all of the time. This is something you use a lot without knowing it when people who are not in your field sort of explain problems, is you rely on your expertise from field. But there's also something you can cultivate in yourself, right? So I've had conversations with myself, both as an expert and what would I do if I were this person that is my sort of hobby. And you can grow and learn to be a bit more T-shaped. If you're willing to take another challenge, it won't take any time in here, but if you're willing to take another challenge, on your way home, go to a bookstore if you can find one. Go to a bookstore. In the back wall of almost every bookstore is a magazine rack. go grab 5 magazines that you would just have nothing to do with. Right? Go grab a photography and a gardening magazine and a motocross magazine and just flip through them and read through them and see what comes up. Right? Just see what comes up if you have a much wider stimulus than what you're used to. Right? One of the dangerous things we can do is only ever read things that are in our own field, because we're limiting our ability to be T-shaped. And this idea of T-shaped extends beyond just the individual, right? Because when you get a team of T-shaped people together, beautiful things happen, as long as you're willing to abandon what I call the lone creator myth. There's this mythology around successful entrepreneurs, millionaires, right? And also incredibly skilled inventors and artists, right? That they sort of did it alone, right? Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel, but he did it with 13 other people, right? And Thomas Edison, we all know Thomas Edison invented the what? The light bulb, sort of. There were 22 people in front of him that invented it first. In fact, his first patent was actually for improvement in electric lights, right? The interesting thing, though, is that Thomas Edison, when we picture him working on the light bulb, we picture him alone in his workshop, testing however many thousands of filaments he tested. I tried to find that one, actually, what the exact number was. And I got everything from 600 to 10,000 in different published sources. So we don't really know. And actually, one of the sources suggested the whole thing was a ruse, and he knew about carbonized bamboo filament before he even started talking about his grand search. Interesting, right? What I believe Thomas Edison's greatest invention was actually his process, and a thing that he invented called Menlo Park. And Menlo Park was a facility that he built with some money from his original inventions, his first few inventions, and he invited a lot of different people to come in and collaborate. They called themselves the muckers, because they were always just sort of mucking about in different fields and playing together and collaborating. Most of them actually share the patents that Edison we regard for. A lot of Edison's patents have other names on them, and they're the names of the muckers. But early on in collaborating, they found out that this sort of myth of Thomas Edison was really, really kind of more valuable than saying, well, 16 different people who you don't know all worked on it. So they played into it, and they kind of allowed Edison, the marketer, to step forward while they all collaborated behind the scenes. I think it's a really interesting approach, and one that we see in a lot of different fields of when you're building and you're working on something. Usually there's a team behind it, or there's at least a pair, right? I see this myth now a lot in the San Francisco Bay Area and Silicon Valley. We tell stories about the one entrepreneur, right? In the book, I talk a little bit about Twitter and a little about Square, and everybody says Jack Dorsey founded Twitter and then founded Square. Not true. Jack Dorsey and some people founded Twitter, and Jack Dorsey and other people founded Square. Usually behind every successful solo act, we find a team of people that aren't really getting enough credit, but are vital to that process. Right? The interesting thing is there's even some research to show how to build those teams, and it's very reminiscent of the muckers. There was a study done by Brian Uzi and Jarrett Spiro. They looked at Broadway production teams. And basically what they wanted to do was find out on a year-by-year basis what was the level of diversity going on in Broadway production teams. Now, Broadway is really interesting because it's really broad, not the street, but the actual field of play, but it's also very narrow. It's a smaller, close-knit community. There's a limited number of people, even if there's a lot of them, that are working on shows. And what that creates is an opportunity for some collaborations that are lots of old friends who have been working together for a long time, and some collaborations that are totally new. And year by year, Uzi and Spiro started rating how frequent were the collaborations tried and true, how frequent were they sort of brand new. And you know what they found? They found that the most successful Broadway years, production-wise, the ones that had shows that won the most critical acclaim, that returned investment much greater, what they found was that those teams scored on a scale of 1 to 5 about a 2.6. Those shows had a level of diversity that was a mix of old colleagues and new people, not unlike the way the muckers sort of came and went in the Menlo Park facility and worked on some projects together and other projects alone. Right? And when I talked to, this research is not actually all that new. It's been out there for a little while. But when I talked to Brian Uzi and Jarrett Spiro about it, I said, what's the misconception of your research on teamwork? Because we all sort of know that if we can have some level of diversity in a team, we'll benefit. What's the misconception? He said, the misconception is that we didn't look at teams. We looked at a network. And so if your team is diverse, it will only be diverse for a short period of time before everybody gets used to working together. The real skill is to plug yourself into a network with which on a project-by-project basis you can be building these teams. That's what we see in the most creative years for Broadway shows. We see that it's the way the network works that allows these combinations. So I think that has some interesting implications for your ability to sort of be T-shaped and to work with other people that are T-shaped. Are you plugging yourself into a network of people that you can pull from in certain times, or do you always go back to the same people? Right? You could be stifling some insights that you need. Right? And you may want to talk to a couple golfers. So. But if you get all those creative minds together and you have these diverse teams and you're constantly rotating them around, you're bound to run into a little bit of friction. And we have this other myth about this friction that it's always sort of a bad thing. Most of the time I've encountered conflict in an organization, it has been detrimental to the performance of the organization. And therefore, most people assume that if we're going to have incredibly productive and incredibly creative companies, we need to eliminate all conflict. And we see a lot of training materials and books and literature on reducing conflict. But in some cases, we actually do that at our peril. Some of the most innovative companies out there fight all the time, but they fight on the right things. So in the book, I look at Pixar. Everybody's fairly familiar with Pixar, the animation studio. If you've ever been to their campus, if you ever get the chance to go to their campus, you should go. I've only ever been to their campus as in standing at a locked gate and looking at it. But it's a magical campus. There's a 20-foot tall Luxo lamp on the grounds, just a statue of the Luxo lamp that they made famous, just on the grounds. Right? There are slides and foosball tables, and we think about most tech companies, and we think about what Pixar looks like. Right? We don't have casual Friday, we have casual every day, and bring your animals to work. I won't even say pets, just bring whatever animals you want. And the food is free, and here's some dry cleaning thrown in, and all of this stuff. We think, boy, that must be a wonderful place to work. I bet they never fight. The truth is at Pixar, they fight almost every day. They have regular times in their production schedule where they display the film in progress to anyone who will watch. And the people who are watching tear the film apart. In some cases, they refer to these sessions as shredding, because they will frame by frame shred the film apart. Now, keep in mind, Pixar animates at 26 frames a second. So it's a really slow and agonizing process to go frame by frame and critique what's wrong. And it can leave you sort of feeling soul-drenched at the end of it. You've worked really, really hard on maybe a couple frames yesterday, and then they get torn apart. But what Pixar does is they make sure that you are not just leaving with a list of stuff you're awful at. Right? You don't need an inventory of the ways in which you suck. In fact, what you need is what Ed Catmull calls the process of going from suck to non-suck. Ed Catmull says that every Pixar film begins at suck and ends at non-suck, and then we ship it off and we win an Academy Award. And 26 Academy Awards later, their process is working. And here's what they do to make that process work, to keep it task-focused and to keep you from leaving with just critiques. They steal from improv. They call it plussing. Has anybody ever taken an improvisation class? So one of the primary rules in an improv class, if you've taken it, is always accept an offer. You come on stage and they say, "Oh, detective, I'm so glad you're here." You're a detective. Always accept an offer. You don't say, "Oh, no, I'm just a guy on the street, I saw the whole thing." Ruins the whole flow. You always have to accept an offer. The idea behind that is to always be building off what people are doing. And so the idea behind plussing is you can critique, you can shred this apart, we can fight over this. But you owe me a plus, you owe me a suggestion on how we can make it better. It's not enough to say, let's say we're animating Toy Story 3. It's not enough to say, I don't like Willie's eyes. He looks inauthentic when he smiles because his eyes are that way. You have to say, what if we narrow them at the sides so we can create a little more authentic looking smile? You have to have both. Right? You have to always be building. Even when you're complimenting, you have to be plussing. You have to be continuously extending an offer, accepting an offer, and gradually building from suck to non-suck. But this works in a variety of fields. Right? This idea of plussing is a technique that can be used to have any sort of critique be much more useful and productive. And if you know where this is going, I'll prove it to you. So we have a room full of hobbyists who have not gotten a chance to get an insight yet tonight, and we're going to rectify that right here. So now, hobbyists, you can go back to your job. You can go back to being experts. And I want you to talk to your partner about a project you are working on. Don't tell them a problem, just the project you're working on. Your partner, you get to do two things. You get to point out what you think is wrong with it, but you owe them a plus. And by the way, if you're explaining it and they just critique, just shake them a little bit and say, you owe me a plus. Because we only have 3 minutes. Are you ready? So they're going to explain their project, and you're going to return back and say, here's what I think, here's what's wrong, here's your plus. Make sense? Let's go to work. So I'm going to go ahead and assume that one works a little bit better. Because it was a little bit harder to get you all to calm down after that one. How did that feel? Good? Interesting? Right? I think there's a tendency, especially in business, at least as I've seen, is to do this thing too often with a critique called a compliment sandwich. Some of you have probably had to eat a compliment sandwich at some point in your life. If you don't know what that is, a compliment sandwich is when you tell someone a compliment, then you rip them to shreds, then you tell them another compliment. And so at the end of it, you don't know if you're being fired or promoted because you're just confused. What's beautiful to me about plussing is there's a simplicity to it. Here's the critique. Here's how to improve. Anyone have one they're willing to share, have an insight that they really, really thought was beautiful? Yeah.
So to get to the short thing of my work problem, I'm trying to get women to...
That's it. Yeah. Okay.
This is a
Moving
work
on.
problem. I'm trying to get, it's a long story. I'm trying to get women to publicly declare their age. To be... Okay? To be comfortable with their age. It's a long story.
There's a lot of people in this room who want to plus you right now.
So it's just something that it's a societal change we want to make, long story, to get women to be able to stand on the corner, and it's like, well, what's the creative idea we're trying to solve? To get a woman to stand on the corner and say, I'm 44, I'm so thrilled to be 44. So we got two really great pluses. From the runner's perspective, it was like, I am happy to run a marathon. I don't have to shout out my time to someone, because the point is I just ran a marathon, and that is so freaking huge that's such a big deal. I don't have to shout that out from the rooftop. So that was the first plus, which was like, okay, so my idea is kind of dumb.
But the plus,
I really took that,
right.
Maybe I misunderstood that plus, but I did understand it as a plus. And then the second was from the point of the hobbyist who draws, was, I am not so sure about always showing my work to everybody, but what I want to do with drawing is start small. So I'm not going to stand on the street corner and show my work to everybody, because that's maybe not the best idea. But maybe I want to start with a trusted group or a small group, and slowly, and if I'm comfortable showing them my drawings, slowly work it out. So again, it was like, okay, so my idea is dumb, but with the great pluses on top, the confidence sandwich, which I was like, so I need to start smaller. So both of those I thought were really great for my strange problem.
Yeah. I'm glad we could help. I'm actually really glad we could help. So this is another technique that can be very, very useful for building and refining ideas. And at the end of this process, I said earlier, the end of this process, as Ed Catmull describes it, we can go from suck to non-suck. We can have our amazing ideas, our new project, ready to implement, ready for the world to really accept it. And we run into another myth. And this one, I believe, is the most powerful, because this one is really stifling. The other 9 myths have to do with how can we generate more and better creative ideas and refine our work so that we can have a better overall output. But if we don't solve this myth, we might be doing all of that in vain. What the mousetrap myth essentially says, it's taken from that phrase, if you build a better mousetrap, the world will beat a path to your door. How many of you have heard that phrase? Total rubbish. So take the actual mousetrap. I said mousetrap. I know what all of you are visualizing. You're visualizing a wooden board with a spring on it, maybe some cheese, because there's always free cheese in a mousetrap, right? You're picturing a mousetrap that was invented in 1899. And every year in the United States, at least 400 new patent applications arrive for people who believe they have invented a better mousetrap. And of that, only about 20 were ever developed into products, and very few of them were ever commercially viable, because we would still hold on to that idea. Right? That's the literal mousetrap. But history is filled with metaphorical mousetraps, great ideas that when being presented were initially rejected. Xerox invented the personal computer. Kodak invented the digital camera. Ironically, the digital camera that led to their bankruptcy. Right? Even in music, we look at someone like Igor Stravinsky, who is famous not only for changing the path of musical composition in ballet with The Rite of Spring, but for causing not one, but 2 riots on opening night, because it was too much of a divergence too soon for the Parisian audience that watched it. Right? Great ideas get rejected all the time. There's a hidden bias that we all share. We're all afflicted with it against these creative ideas. We say we want more creative ideas. But for an idea to be truly sort of creative, right, the definitions are still being weighed out by lots of academics and researchers and people. But for an idea, they all converge on, if an idea is creative, it is novel and it is useful. But we have a really hard time judging the novel against the status quo we're using to judge what counts as useful. Right? Especially in periods of uncertainty, the research suggests that we would much more likely hang out with the status quo. And even if we overtly say we need a creative idea to solve our problem, we're going to judge whether or not those new ideas work based on that status quo, and we're going to retreat to it. In a lot of research, this actually makes it less likely that when presented with an idea that everyone agrees upon in the outset as being creative, right? When we introduce uncertainty, the people who haven't seen the idea but are a little bit uncertain reject it as a creative idea. They say it'll never work. In organizations, this is especially dangerous because we create what a friend of mine, Dave Owens, calls a hierarchy of no. For an idea to get implemented in most organizations, it has to go up this hierarchy, but just one no will shoot it back down. Right? And truthfully, I think in society, this is even more dangerous. Right? Because we have a society that very much wants to reinforce the myths and the stories we're telling ourselves and very much wants to shoot down a lot of different divergence. Right? It's why so few people in that diffusion of innovation curve that we have, some of us might be familiar with, we teach in a lot of different marketing textbooks and things like that. It's why so few people accept the initial idea. Because it's new and untried, and we all have this internal bias. Right? And the truth is, unless we kind of overcome this bias, and everything we do to stimulate ourselves to be more creative and to make our process better so we can have a better, more creative product, service, strategy, whatever it is, unless we can counter this myth, this bias against creativity, we're not really going to get very far. We sort of have to kind of address it. We have to stand up kind of and say, Hi, my name is Dave, and I actually don't like creative ideas. Right? I have a hidden bias. Right? A lot of the most innovative companies out there have found ways to defer judgment on ideas to allow them to sort of be tested on a small scale. We learn from those ideas, we refine, and then we know better. Some companies actually put in idea stock markets. Right? So instead of relying on a hierarchy of no, we democratize the idea. Right? And so anybody can invest in this idea. And if enough people invest, no matter what their title is, it moves forward. But I believe in society we probably need something similar. Right? We need some similar thing to counteract this bias. So I said at the outset that we have this divine, mysterious process, and we fashion some people as the high priests of creativity and other people sort of out of reach from creativity. But yet, what I see, I have a 2-year-old son, and we're kind of thinking about and beginning to talk about kindergarten. And when I see a kindergarten classroom, I see 25 creative kids all running around. By the time they arrive to me as undergraduates in college, out of 25, maybe 2 of them are creative. And both of them are marketing majors. Right? Or at least they're saying they're creative because they're marketing majors and they think that's the right answer, which is probably even more dangerous. Right? So somehow over time, a lot of us just ignore that we can be all that creative. And the truth is, I think this bias does it to us. Because when we run up against authority figures, when we run up against people in our lives that we present our new ideas to, this bias overrules their willingness to sort of put our new idea forward. As a result, it gets rejected, and eventually we learn to just stop having them. And it becomes really just easier than putting up with rejection. It's just easier to say, well, I'm not creative. But I hope if you're leaving here tonight with any ideas, it's number one, that everybody has the potential to be creative. There's processes and techniques that you can learn. There's myths to overcome, but everyone has that potential. And the other is that this bias exists, and it's a problem we probably need to start talking about. We need to rewrite all of these different myths so we can have a society. We have problems that need a very creative solution. But more than that, right? More than we need new ideas and fresh ideas, we need to get better at spreading the great ideas we already have and are already capable of. That's an idea that's worth spreading. That's a myth that's worth rewriting. So I hope if you've kind of gained anything from tonight, you'll actually join me in that fight and join me in helping to spread this idea. We need more creative ideas. We need to get better at spreading them. Help me to sort of rewrite these myths and help me let everybody tell a story that's true and is actually true. So thank you so much for joining me tonight.
5 minutes. You want to take questions?
Yeah. So, okay, I want to take questions. So there's a question.
Yeah, I thought your point about taking team members from a network on a per project basis. So I was just wondering, at what point does that network become useful? So, for example, do we say that Rotman MBA is our network, or do we want to extend and make it more diverse and say University of Toronto?
So the question is about the network's idea and being plugged into a network that allows you to have project-based teams, et cetera, and where do we draw the line on what constitutes our network? I think that question changes depending on sort of who you are. If you're looking for yourself, I think that network is however you want to define it, how broadly you want to define it. If you're looking at it from sort of an organizational leadership perspective, I think you kind of want to look at your organization, or at least the people who work in your organization and the stakeholders as the network, but then ask yourself, how do we need to change that, right? So a traditional hierarchical system might be really bad for allowing, I think a lot of us have experimented with cross-functional teams. It didn't really work out to us. We need to look at how do we kind of restructure that. There is, ironically, a really good article by a gentleman you guys might be familiar with, Roger Martin, that talks about the economics of the hierarchy, especially in periods of upturns and downturns, and it might not be the cycle of layoffs and rehiring to fit an organizational chart might not be the right way to go. Maybe we do need financially to shift to more project-based work so that we can stem those ebbs and flows. So I'm actually really encouraged by that, because I think not only is there a creativity case for that new sort of network structure, there's a financial case to be made too, which is really exciting to me. Yes?
Yes. With organizations like Kickstarter, do you see that as almost like a natural, almost rebellion against all these kinds of creativity that society is almost seeing that anybody can be creative and anybody can have a good idea? I'm curious to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, so the question is a site like Kickstarter, does it sort of buck the trend, buck this myth about not everybody can be creative because it's so many different people posting on it? And short answer, yes. I see sites like Kickstarter, but also Etsy, et cetera, as being sites where people, now that they have a platform to kind of display it, we're seeing just how creative people can get. And especially if you've ever followed friends on like Pinterest, if you have a Pinterest account, you've ever followed it, they're actually surprisingly creative in a field you didn't know because you've just never seen them in that light. The other thing I think is really exciting about Kickstarter is that actually this crowdfunding idea, I don't know that it really would count, what Kickstarter is would count as crowdfunding by definition, but it's actually a way to sort of test ideas before you're financially committed to launching a product, which to me is really, really useful, especially in light of this mousetrap myth idea. You can put it out there, explain how it works, see if the market will respond positively or negatively, and then if it's negative, you're not out nearly as much as you would be. I just actually wrote a piece about Coin, the company Coin that has the one card to rule them all sort of idea. And they had a pre-order and then extended it, and they sold. They won't even disclose how many they sold, but it's just a wonderful way to almost sell your product before it exists, so you can see what the market reaction is going to be. So I think that's the real benefit too of a site like Kickstarter. Other thoughts, questions? Maybe one more. I know from my experience as a professor that does not mean there are no questions. That just means you don't want to ask it in public. So I'm obviously around. If you can do that, I'd love to chat and love to keep this conversation going. I'm not hard to find. Please come find me. Let's chat about it.
Okay, so before I thank David, I'd like to let everyone know that the Rotman team is going to be selling copies of David's book just outside the door for the next 10 minutes, and I believe you also signed each copy as well. So David, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and wisdom.
Thank you.
A lot of food for thought, and thank you all for